This is part 32 of my series on my Engage model railway project. Previous parts covered the project from its inception through the creation of the baseboard, selection and laying of track, building of scenic items, obtaining rolling stock, etc. The project is ongoing. A couple of weeks ago I made a trip down to Delhi, Ontario, spelt like Delhi in India but pronounced Delhi, to visit a model railway store which Google told me existed there, Tiny Railroads, and here you can see their storefront. And here's the interior of the store in a picture from their website, tinyrailroads.com, link in video description below. I honestly didn't expect to find a lot that would be relevant to me since I'm modelling pre-nationalisation British railway operations in the East Midlands in British Engage. Naturally, most hobby stores here in Ontario, Canada deal mainly with North American railroads, and inasmuch as they do N at all, do American European N scale at 1 to 160, with some Japanese stuff at 1 to 150. Finding stuff in British Engage at 1 to 148 is not really to be expected, so all I'd really expect to get from a local store would be landscaping supplies, maybe something in the building line that I could use, and track items, of course. An exception would be British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario, britishmodeltrains.ca, link also in video description below. But even Nigel with British Model Trains doesn't handle British Engage rolling stock, although he does carry many scenic items in British Engage. Anyway, I was pleasantly surprised when I visited Tiny Railroads, since, although the focus is still more North American, Tiny Railroads also handle used and consignment items, so there was much more variety than I expected, including quite a bit of stuff in British Engage, and some interesting books. So here's what I brought back from my trip, apart from the books, which we'll see separately. As you can see, I found quite a few things that I thought were worth picking up. The rolling stock is a bit outside my prototype, really, mostly being either the wrong region or the wrong period, but at the reasonable prices for used items compared to what it costs me to import things from the UK, I thought it was worth picking these items up to see what I could do with them. Here's a close-up of the rolling stock I got. The Farish post office carriage is a British Rail error, of course. The Farish wagon at top is northeastern and might have found its way into the LNER, which is the secondary company I model. Mainly I focus on the LMS. The three Rocco wagons are really German, I would assume. The item that's closest to fitting in with my prototype is the teak LNER coach, the brown coach in the middle at left. But I believe that's more of a suburban break coach. And so far I've really only been including mainline express LNER. Apart from the rolling stock, I got quite a few kit items. Being a long-time Statlic modeler, I do enjoy building things from kits. I couldn't resist the little Fleetline Tiger Moth kit, as I've always been fond of that aeroplane. I have several flying radio-controlled Tiger Moths, and I thought it would be good to add a model moth to the model railway somehow. I also picked up a couple of rather obscure rolling stock kits and a couple of Kato items to aid in track modifications. Round the edges here you can see some more of the kits and some wagon loads and extra telegraph poles that I also got. And here are the books that I picked up. Tiny Railroads had quite a variety of books and magazines on British railways. I chose these as being of particular interest to me. A binder with several issues of the Journal of the British Engage Society, a book with some very interesting photos relating to the construction of the Great Central Railway, a couple of books on railway history, and a couple of books, the two in the centre, that are themselves historical. I wasn't quite sure when this edition of the Wonder Book of Railways would have been published, since there was no publication date on it. When I started to read it at home, I realised that it was almost certainly published during the 1920s, as it refers to the amalgamation of the railways, which took place in 1923, as something recent which hasn't yet been gotten used to, and indeed the pre-amalgamation terms are used in much of its content. The Arthur Elton book at top centre is not quite that old, having been published in the 1940s after the Second World War, but it's an interesting volume with some nice hand-painted illustrations. Here's one of the plates from the Elton book showing the LMS Camden Town sheds in 1935. And here's another couple of pages from that book relating to the era of the first passenger railways. Here are a selection of wagon loads that I got from tiny railroads, and also behind them one mineral wagon that I picked up, in need of a bit of gluing, but otherwise quite operable. There are bits of various other things on my bench, as usual. Here are a couple of those brick loads in some wagons that I got from the UK. Leicester is where I grew up, so it's pretty much the focal point of my view on railway history. Whilst I was at it, I also fixed the stone loads that I had put into these mineral wagons previously. I initially just put in loose woodland scenic small stones, but then every time the wagons got knocked over for some reason, a big mess would result that took a long time to clear up. So I fixed the loads in place by spraying with alcohol and then dripping in scenic cement. This did work. The wagons now don't lose their loads when they tip. Another thing that I brought back from tiny railroads was a pack of Cato tight radius curves. I used these to replace the Bachmann curves that I had previously used in the outer corner siding seen here. Generally, I'd rather stick to Cato Unitrack. I only used the Bachmann curves in this siding because I didn't have anything Cato on hand that would work, and I wanted to get the siding in place. Anyhow, here's that siding area slightly remodelled with the new Cato curves installed. And various trains standing in the sidings, of course. I wasn't really at all sure what to do with the Farish post office carriages. Perhaps I shouldn't have even bothered to pick them up, but I've always been interested in post office rail operations. I was a bit disappointed to see how these carriages were made. There's really almost no moulded detail at all. They just made the body from transparent plastic and then printed onto that, making doors, windows, livery, etc. This didn't really offer me much scope for usefully repainting, but I bought 3 of this type of coach, so I thought I'd go ahead and play around with one of them. Here it is disassembled. You can see the various parts as it comes apart, the body, the base, the roof, and the bogies. I masked off the door and window areas, and then I spray painted everything crimson. Actually, I sprayed primer first, as I found that the plastic didn't take paint at all well. Here's that coach after reassembly with one of the other type of Farish post office coach I picked up. Here's a non-flash picture, which looks better, but still this may be rather a pointless exercise. I wish I could get proper LMS travelling post office items, but it seems nobody's ever made anything in N-gauge, not even as kits. Hornby did do a nice set in 00 gauge at one point. Here are the wagons I got from tiny railroads, making up a rather strange train behind a Horwich Mogul crab locomotive. Leading the train is the double bogie northeastern wagon, and then the 3 Rocco back box cars, which I assume really represent German originals, and then the re-glued mineral wagon with its load, and bringing up the rear are a 15-foot Pico tank wagon built from a kit, and an LMS brake van. Here's the front of that train behind the first of the cottages by Scraptoft Station. I had to fiddle around with this train quite a bit to get it to stay coupled, as these items from various different manufacturers didn't have their Rapido couplings installed very consistently. Here's the little Fleet Line Tiger Moth kit assembled and getting an initial painting. The interwing struts were really too long, but rather than trying to modify them, which would have been very fiddly, if possible at all, I used them as they were and just let the wings sit a bit higher, and I added extra struts at the front, so this ended up being none too accurate a model of the Tiger Moth. I also thought it looked very small even for 1:148 scale, and I was somewhat correct. I measured this model, and its scale wingspan is about 24 feet, whereas the wingspan of a Tiger Moth should really be just over 29 feet. It's not horribly far wrong, but it is a bit small. Here's the plane with a bit more detail painting. And here's a view from the rear, where it probably looks most like a Tiger Moth. I wasn't going to do a lot of detail painting on something this tiny. I did put some decals on the wing for basic registration letters. Here's the plane landed in a field on the layout beside the crab loco. And here without flash. The plane does look very small in context. I also built these 2 rolling stock kits that I picked up from Tiny Railroads, but I think I'm going to break off here and cover the building of those kits in my next video, as otherwise this part would get rather long.